Good morning and welcome. My name is Ryan Olson and I'm a research faculty member here at UVA, and on behalf of the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture, I'd like to welcome you to this symposium on virtue and flourishing in the Catholic and Lutheran traditions. We think this is a historic symposium, bringing together leading Catholic and Lutheran theologians to explore the moral life and moral communities in the context of a great American public university. And if that's not unprecedented, perhaps doing so during the first week of Eastertide or on the day after the passing of Pope certainly makes history. Here at the university, the Institute studies cultural change and seeks to understand the intellectual and moral resources needed to flourish in our late modern world. This late modern moment is one we frequently characterize with the term rupture. A rupture with the past and with the moral orders that made sense of the world, of ourselves as human persons, of the language and meanings we employ, and of our communities. With Angel Parham, whom you'll meet later, I direct the program on culture and formation at the Institute. And this symposium is part of the Moral Ecology Trust series. Moral ecology is a concept that helps our research and programs to understand and encourage the most favorable institutional conditions for the formation of good children, wise leaders, and virtuous citizens. We published this book a few years ago called The Content of Their Character, Inquiries into the Varieties of Moral Formation. There are a few extra copies on the back if you're interested. To understand the formation of young people in 10 types of American high schools, Catholic and Protestant to be sure, as well as Jewish, Islamic, charter, urban public, homeschooling families, elite independent schools, and others. Digging much more deeply now into the ethical sources of some of those institutions, we're delighted to learn from these two enormously important theological traditions, not only for the benefit of the Christians within these traditions and related to these traditions, but also for the benefit of all human beings and our broader societies. The Notre Dame sociologist Christian Smith recently published Why Religion Went Obsolete, the Demise of Traditional Faith in America. In point 17 of many more, summarizing what he calls the millennial zeitgeist, he writes this: "The possibility of a historical tradition guiding one's life is nearly inconceivable. At most, tradition means family holiday customs such as Christmas tree decorating or Thanksgiving dinner. Positive, formative, substantive, moral continuity of identities and practices across generations are almost unimaginable." Someone else who recognizes this challenge and the opportunities that it presents is my friend, colleague, and visiting co-host of this symposium, Professor James Arthur from the University of Birmingham in the UK and the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University. Professor Arthur founded the Jubilee Center for Character and Virtues in 2012, which has been enormously successful around the country in promoting character education. And he's going to say a few words now. Professor Arthur.
Thank you, Ryan. Ryan and I decided to put this conference together because we thought it was important to have insights from Christianity into this character and virtue field, because most of the work in character is largely secular in orientation, and so we thought that it would be useful to do this. I want to begin by just giving you a little story about communicating with each other. This is the story. There was a rich bachelor who lived alone with a cat, which he adored. He and the cat were looked after by a faithful manservant. The bachelor went off on holiday to the south of France, leaving the manservant in charge of Tiddles, the cat. On arrival at his hotel, he was presented with a telegram which stated, "Tiddles dead." He was deeply shocked and immediately returned to London, where he berated his manservant for tactlessness and insensitivity. He said, "Look here, Wilkins, if anything similar should occur again, you should send a telegram saying Tiddles is on the roof and won't come down. Then wait a few hours before sending a second telegram saying Tiddles fell off roof, badly injured. Then wait a few more hours before sending a third telegram saying, regret, Tiddles is dead. That way it lessens the shock." The manservant took note of this and apologised. The next year, the man went off on holiday as usual, On his arrival at the hotel, he found a telegram awaiting him, which said, "Your mother's on the roof and won't come down." Now, last year, David Brooks at the New York Times said that students are taught and tutored many things except the most important, which he said was character. He said, when it comes to this, most universities leave them alone. You could summarize Brooks's view thus: today we are super competent when it comes to efficiency, utility, speed, convenience, and getting ahead in the world. But we're at a loss concerning what this is all for. This lack of cultural and moral confidence about what makes a life worth living is perhaps the deepest cause of living in our interesting time. To argue for the importance of character development in universities is not to diminish the importance of specialist knowledge and the acquisition of technical skills, the more instrumental functions of a university. However, as a sole focus on competence, knowledge, and skills, this is not sufficient to achieve the aims that university mission statements often set themselves, or the value that employers and students are seeking. Each year, students enter universities with a mixture of excitement and anticipation. Some students seek to acquire a philosophy of life, others a secure and well-paid job. However, leaving the student to take responsibility for his or her own ethical development on the basis that it's a matter of personal choice may not promote the common good of society or the flourishing of the student. The person you become because of the total experience of being a student means that we should not leave the fostering of qualities other than cognitive skills to chance. The development of character or personal qualities must go beyond the corporate rhetoric of the modern university. By character, we decide not just what we ought to do, but who we ought to become. Universities should encourage students to answer two fundamental questions. And I'd like you to think of these questions as we hear our 6 excellent speakers today. Who am I, and how should I live? These questions lead to further questions. What should I do? What should I be? What should I love? What kind of life do I want to live? So we do have 6 outstanding speakers today, and I would like you to think about those types of questions as we hear their presentations. Thank you.
And to kick us off now in this first session is Pastor Ben Mayton of Emmanuel Lutheran Church here in Charlottesville. Pastor Mayton, thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. And Professor as well, especially for the tale about Tittles. I'm a parish pastor, Emmanuel Lutheran Church here in Charlottesville. As a parish pastor, I'm called upon to preach every week, always looking for content for the sermons, and likely Tittles and Tittles' mother-in-law, I don't know, whatever she was, will make it into a sermon sometime. And thank you, Ryan, for inviting me to be here, and also to introduce our first 2 speakers, and then moderate what will hopefully be some time for Q&A at the end of that. Yes, our first speaker will be the Reverend Dr. Jordan Cooper. He is an ordained Lutheran pastor, the executive director of Just and Sinner, a fellow of systematic theology at the Widener Institute, okay, I pronounced it correctly, and the chair of Lutheran dogmatics at the American Lutheran Theological Seminary. He also serves as a campus minister, saying he especially enjoys this. In his other roles, he spends a lot of time with screens and enjoys the actual in-the-flesh interaction with students as a campus minister for the Lutheran Student Fellowship at Cornell University. Immediately following Dr. Cooper, Father Ezra Sullivan will speak. Father Sullivan is a professor of moral theology and psychology at the University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome, otherwise known as the Angelicum. He's a native of California, a Dominican friar of the province of St. Joseph in the United States. He served parish after ordination to the priesthood and earning his doctorate in theology before going to teach at the Angelicum. And so, welcome first, Dr. Cooper.
Thank you.
Well, good morning. It's great to see you all here this morning. Thanks for getting up and coming here, especially to the college students that are here this morning. I know coming to things in the morning is not always easy for college students. I am going to be presenting a paper, but I'm probably going to diverge from it a little bit. So we'll just kind of see how this goes here. What does it mean to live the good life? That is really the central question of ethics. And when we're talking about that central question, there are so many elements that need to be said in order to answer that question rightly. So a comprehensive answer to this question, if such a thing is even possible, would take significantly more time than any of us has here, and certainly than I myself have here in this singular presentation. And so what I'm going to do then is focus on one central element of what it means to live the good life, one central element of an ethical system, a Christian ethic in particular, and that is love. Well, the construction of any ethic or a conception of what a human being is has to arise from a question of what is a human being, right? If the questions of what are we to do, or what is a thing for, and what is a thing, are interdependent. And so in order to have a clear ethical norm and system, we need to have a robust philosophical or theological anthropology as a groundwork on which to build. Even if someone does not have at least a conscious awareness of an anthropological system when doing ethics, these perceptions are so inherent to providing any moral direction that they always lie beneath the surface, even if that is unconsciously so. If human beings, for example, are mere physical objects who consist solely in biological parts that function in a purely deterministic manner, then a human person's end must similarly be a biological one, perhaps consisting in the passing on of our genetic code or some other similar biological process. Alternately, consider another commonly held view of what man is, that the human being is not biologically determined, but is instead constituted by an autonomous, self-moving will, through which one's own being is individually chosen. If this is how someone views human nature, then the end of such a creature must consist in the exercise of freedom in which all restraints are removed, or the attempt to create a world in which autonomy can be maximized among individually existent subjects. And so in view of this interrelation between nature and the moral, I first ask this question upon which ethics builds, and that is, what is a human being? Aristotle famously differentiated between human beings and the animal kingdom with his definition of man as a rational animal. Human nature is not solely constituted by the use of rendering in Aristotle's definition, as human beings share all sorts of things with the rest of the natural world. With both plant and animal life, human beings have a nutritive soul, which consists in the reception of nutrients that cause one to grow and sustain those biological processes which are necessary for bodily life. With animals, human beings also have appetites. We hunger, we thirst, we become fatigued, and have various other inner sensations that arise from various biological functions and needs that can be fulfilled through specific actions like eating or drinking or sleeping. And yet, though human beings are animals in some sense, in another sense, we live a distinct and a higher life than they do. Human persons have an ability to mentally distance themselves from their surroundings and from their bodily appetites so that they might reflect upon these things and make free decisions to act as a result of this reflection. Well, our understanding of animal life certainly has developed significantly since, the 4th century BC. Aristotle's insights here, I think, remain basically correct. While it probably would be inaccurate to say that the animal has no mental life at all, even the most ardent animal rights activist does not argue for moral culpability among the lesser species, as there is a recognition that animals do not have the two necessary prerequisites of moral responsibility: rationality and freedom. And still, though Aristotle is correct in his assessment, I think, of the role of reason in differentiating human beings from other living entities, this by itself does not seem to encapsulate the actions, the direction, the driving impulses of the human psyche. Men and women are not mere logical machines who evaluate their actions and those of others through comprehensive syllogistic reasoning or modal logic or repeated observable experimentation. Now, I don't think that this is only due to the fact that there are these kind of competing drives that we have within us between the appetites and reason. I think human beings are driven far more often than rationality by an inner desire for beauty, an inner desire for goodness or purpose. Paul Tillich spoke about this as the ultimate concern. His idea is that people have some ultimate thing, some ultimate telos, some end toward which they strive. Now, this ultimate end that we build our lives around may manifest in distinct ways, whether in religion or political activism or some other perceived good. And it is to this perceived good or end that reason is directed and to which the affections are rightly aimed. I think on this point, Plato is often superior to his student. Plato believed that the desire of human beings to fulfill their rational needs was only rightly directed when it pointed away from the physical world to the transcendent. While he recognized that desires are, to some extent, fulfilled within the events of the physical world, material things always leave a kind of emptiness or a sense of longing for something greater. True fulfillment is not really found in the physical at all, which is a mere copy of a greater reality, but in the ideal realm of the forms or ideas. One of the desires which Plato identifies within people is this longing for beauty. For Plato, the human being finds some beauty in the material world, but there is a far truer beauty which supersedes material objects that satisfies human desires. Beauty has a kind of attractive force which draws the individual in when it is seen or grasped or experienced. This attraction to the beautiful brings about an encounter which evokes pleasure. And by pleasure here, I don't mean just mere kind of momentary enjoyment or some kind of sensual excitement, but something more than that, greater than that, a feeling of inner delight in which an innate need or thirst is quenched. Now, though their books continue to provide helpful ideas about the nature of reality and these questions about the good life, Plato and Aristotle wrote by the dim light of natural reason, thereby missing essential elements of human nature as it is expressed in supernatural revelation. There is no conception in either of these Greek thinkers that human beings were created in the imago Dei, or the image of God. Further, love does not really play that significant of a role within either system, which in Christian thought forms the very essence or core of the moral life. It is the definitive summary of the Decalogue, or the Ten Commandments, that are presented by Jesus himself, Matthew 22:37 through 40. According to St. John, not only is the law defined by love, but in some sense God himself is defined by love, as he says, God is love, 1 John 4:8. Now, if it is the case that love defines the divine nature, and just not to make my Thomist friends here nervous, we're speaking analogically, not univocally here, and if man and woman were created to image that nature, then love is the telos of the human life, the goal or the end toward which we are created. What else would it mean that we are to become partakers of the divine nature, as St. Peter says? Well, the Greeks were right, certainly, that reason serves an essential role in guiding the passions. Reason is not an end in itself, but it is to be directed toward a greater and more unifying reality that is love. Love fulfills man's rational, affective, and willing capacities. In view of this inadequacy, I think, in classical thought and the need for an ethic of love, now I'm going to turn to a particular theologian named Ernst Sartorius, a 19th century German Lutheran theologian. Now, the name Ernst Sartorius is rather obscure one. As I say that name, I think most of you probably have no idea who this particular individual was. But he did have a very significant impact in his own day in European theology. He was an author of devotional, of theological, and ethical literature in his own time. And he wrote so prolifically on this theme of love that he is sometimes referred to as the St. John of Lutheranism. Now, Lutherans have this, I think, zealous desire to defend God's gracious activity towards man in Christ that has often led Lutheran scholars and theologians to focus extensively on St. Paul's writings, particularly his writings on the doctrine of justification, but sometimes this has perhaps left a bit of a gap or a neglect at looking at St. John and his unique areas of emphasis. Not that Sartorius is alone in focusing on these things. People like Sartorius, I think, help our tradition to fulfill the desire and need to have a more complete account of New Testament theology and practice. And Sartorius does this through his emphasis on two realities. The first is God's love, and then out of that, the mystical union with God's love, which is the mysterious union that God's people have with him in faith. And so now I turn to a particular work of Sartorius's, his magnum opus, which is called The Doctrine of Divine Love. So Sartorius begins this work with a presentation of a problem that he's trying to address. And that problem is a divorce that he perceives between theology and ethics. This, as he sees it, is not solely a Lutheran problem, but it's a pervasive problem in the post-Enlightenment West in general, especially since the time of Immanuel Kant. For Kant, universal moral principles could be derived solely through rational contemplation, by an evaluation of accepted moral norms with this principle of universality, we call the categorical imperative. The moral is that which applies at all times and in all places without exception. In this approach, there really is no need for religious or theological considerations in ethics, as these principles are derived from reason alone. Kant believed that religion has a kind of practical end, and that it inculcates obedience, especially with promises of reward for good acts and punishment for wrong actions. But for Sartorius, Kant is the end of a trajectory which began much earlier in the post-Reformation era of a continual divide between theory and life. As Lutheran, Roman Catholic, and Reformed scholastic theologians engaged in extensive polemics throughout the 17th century, theologians of each tradition began to devote an increased amount of pages and space in dogmatics manuals to the topic of theological prolegomena, or the first things of theology, basic questions of things like what is theology, what's the relationship between faith and reason. In Sartorius' evaluation, such obsessive and precise methodological discussions eventually began to depersonalize theology, as theology became more theory and was increasingly disconnected from the practical sphere. He argues that this move also occurred with more extensive treatments of the divine attributes in textbooks of this time, which focus so narrowly on God as being and on apophatic theological considerations. And apophatic theology means theology by the way of negation, saying what God is not. That the nature of God as holy love was downplayed to an unfortunate degree. All of this led to that prioritization of theory over practice, which was formally introduced into the Lutheran Academy, at least, when they were explicitly and strongly distinguished by George Calixtus in his 1634 work, Theologia Moralis. None of this is to say that Sartorius didn't advocate for a classical Christian view of God as grounded in divine simplicity, the ideas of analogical predication or divine impassibility, and the other tenets of what we call classical theism. Nor does Sartorius deny the usefulness and need for theological prolegomena when it is relegated to its right and proper place. He certainly is not opposed to robust theological study. This is evident in the fact that Sartorius is just as critical of the Lutheran pietist as he is of these turns in later orthodoxy in the 17th century. As he sees it, the pietists pitted theology and ethics against one another, as if one had to choose one or the other. And so theological study was looked at as something to be perceived as a hindrance to the pious or holy life. But for Sartorius, this notion of love is the core theme that penetrates both of these disciplines. And so he writes a work that purports to be both theology and ethics is one comprehensive system. And so Sartorius' work really is as much of a theological work as an ethical one. He treats many of the traditional topics someone would expect to find in a dogmatics textbook: creation, the nature of sin, the two natures of Christ, the atonement, justification, the sacraments. Along with these topics, he also treats of the moral life through an explanation of the different forms of love, the ordering of loves, the nature of society, and an exposition of the Ten Commandments. Though the topics in the dogmatic section of this work are what one would expect from a Lutheran dogmatician, the way that this book reads is quite different from the 17th century Orthodox writers, and even from his own neo-Lutheran contemporaries, being a kind of revival of Lutheran orthodoxy in the 19th century. His prose, his writing, is really more like that of a church father, particularly Augustine, than the scholastics. So much so that perhaps Dr. Bierman would even like Sartorius' writing. In his exposition of the doctrine of God, Sartorius defines love, God as love, echoing the language of St. John, as I've said. This is the thesis of the work. This is not true only of God's relationship to the world, but love is definitive of the ad intra Trinitarian relations, meaning the internal relations between the triune persons. He argues that it is the notion of divine love which differentiates Christianity from other world religions. As he argues, it is only a Trinitarian God that can be truly loving by essence. Love, by its nature, requires an object toward which it is directed. For Sartorius, self-love is only love in a kind of secondary or really kind of improper sense. Love includes the recognition of that which is not identical with the self. It is the directing of one's attention and affection outward, seeking the good of the other rather than centering on the self. In seeking this good, love involves a recognition of the personhood of the one who is loved, though objects can be loved, in a kind of secondary, lesser sense. In view of this understanding of love, a non-Trinitarian, a unipersonal God, a God who is only a singular person, cannot truly be loving, since a single person cannot exist in an eternal love relation to himself. A monadic God can only love accidentally, meaning he can only love in a contingent way, dependent upon something outside of himself or creation. And so the only alternative to either a Trinitarian model or this accidental model of love, which identifies love as a contingent divine property, is a view which might contend that creation is the eternal unnecessary object of God's love. This model cannot hold in a monotheistic system, as it makes creation determinative for God's own being, his own nature. It deifies creation, makes creation God. So the result is a dualism or pantheism. Love, therefore, must be Trinitarian if it really is essential to the divine nature, as Scripture says. In Sartorius' Trinitarian approach, it is divine love that differentiates between the triune persons. Because ad intra relations, those internal relations of begetting and procession between Father, Son, and Spirit, are relations of love. Love for Sartorius is manifest in giving and receiving. Giving love is that disposition in which one gives of him or herself to another. Receiving love is that disposition wherein one is a recipient of someone else's love. The Father, as the source of both Son and Spirit, is engaged in giving love, in the eternal giving to the Son and the Spirit. In his eternal filiation, his eternal sonship, the Son is the recipient of the Father's love through receiving love, as this reception defines his person as distinct from the Father, while the Father's being unoriginate as pure giving love is what distinguishes him from the Son. The Son does not, however, only receive, but also gives, as the Spirit proceeds from both the Father and the Son, as the eternal love of both persons, and from him no person proceeds or is begotten. It is this eternal double procession which distinguishes the Son from both Father and Spirit. The distinction between persons is thereby grounded in these relations of giving and receiving love. The Father is eternal giving love. The Son is receiving love from the Father and giving love to the Spirit. The Spirit is receiving love as he is the eternal love between Father and Son who proceeds from both and does not give to any other divine person. So these ad intra relations, again meaning intertrinitarian, are the ground through which the opera ad extra, or the external works of God, meaning like creation, redemption, all things that God does outside of himself. This is all an expression of love, as divine love directs itself outward. This means that love is both the origin and the end, or the efficient and final cause of all created things. This is even more evident in human beings over against the rest of creation, who distinctively reflect the divine image. Martin Luther speaks clearly and well about this creative nature of God's love in the Heidelberg Disputation, where he contends that the love of God does not find, but creates that which is pleasing to it. Creation does not arise from some perceived value that it may have in the future within itself. God simply chooses to create. He does it as a free act and a free overflowing of his love. And so creation comes about solely through God's unmerited and free decision. This divine act of freely granted love is a sharing in being or existence, as God creates contingently existing beings to share life with his own necessary being, in which essence and existence are one. The sharing of existence with creatures is an unmerited gift, rather than some inherent right, and such rights in an ultimate sense don't exist. Creation is therefore both an act of grace, meaning it's not compelled by anything outside of God, and of love, in which God gives good gifts, including being itself, to things outside of himself. In summary, love is the essence of all things. Okay, this has been a lot here, and now we're going to move to the subject of anthropology. The discussion turns now to the topic of anthropology. The question to be answered is, okay, well, how does love manifest itself within the human constitution? As indicated in the prior discussion, God exists as necessary, eternal love, and man and woman are created as an act of free, unmerited, divine love. This tie between God's love and human beings is further solidified in the fact that both man and woman are created in the divine image. If God himself is love, so must his image also be love. Now, yes, we can talk in a broader sense about various elements that constitute the divine image, things like rationality or will or freedom or whatever else it might be. But these must not be expressed to the neglect of the centrality of love. While there are remnants of a divine likeness that remain after the fall, there is another sense in which the image of God has been lost after the fall. And it is only recovered through the recreative divine acts of holy baptism. And it's renewed by means of the divine word and Eucharistic participation in Christ. There is this renewal that we have in the image of God that is a renewal of love, which we have often placed under the label of sanctification, at least in broader Protestant theology. I think that label is completely insufficient, and I think most of the time in Scripture it refers to something completely different than what we think. I tend to prefer the language of a Christification, a conformity to Christ and in His image. Now, regarding this love that is within human beings and human communities, and the intertrinitarian life, the life of God, there are various ways that the Christian tradition, especially following St. Augustine, have expressed that in different ways humanity mirrors the Trinitarian nature of God. Man is tripartite in a number of senses. But I'll set all the particular details of that aside for the time being. And instead, I just want to talk quickly here about how love manifests itself in human life. Now, as I've defined love, I've spoken about giving and receiving love. And I think we need to return to that distinction to understand the goal of human life and relationships between people and one another. Now, in human life, these two modes of operating are apparent both in our relation to God and in our relation to other human persons. Regarding the individual's relationship to God, there is both a giving and receiving that establishes and upholds the Christian standing before God as just or righteous. As Sartorius argues here, the Lutheran doctrine of justification does not downplay or negate the centrality of love, which St. Paul says is greater and longer lasting than both faith and hope in 1 Corinthians 13. But it emphasizes divine love and its saving force rather than human love. As St. John testifies, the ultimate manifestation of love is not the personal subject's love for God, but the self-giving of Christ to others and for others through his life, death, and resurrection, in which he manifests, or more properly is, the grace of God for sinners. 1 John 4:10. The gift of divine love justifies sinners, and that love is received by means of faith. Saving love is giving love, which has a downward directionality. It is granted to the sinner by God, and the proper response of the human person is passive reception. Faith justifies, then, not as a mere intellectual assent, but as a posture of filial trust through which divine love is appropriated. Luther testifies to this Christological realism of faith in his 1535 Galatians commentary, where he uses the language to say that Christ is present in faith itself. This Christological gift of love has a twofold effect. It forgives sins through providing Christ's righteousness as a covering, and it bestows spiritual life and new godly impulses. This giving of love from God to sinners is distinct from intertrinitarian relations of giving and receiving love, of course, in a number of ways. Unlike the person of the Spirit who receives from the Father and the Son, the believer has sin, is devoid of merit, and is a creature. However, this God-to-man relationship still remains a kind of reflection of this intertrinitarian life. As divine love, internal to the Godhead, is both giving and receiving, the sinner's justification, coram Deo, or before God, is determined by the giving of God's love and receiving, which is the sinner's faith. Now, beyond justification, the obedience of the regenerate is also defined by love as much as redemption is, though in a different sense. In contrast to some neo-Kantian portrayals, the love of the Christian is not merely an imitation of Christ's life, which grows out of some bare exertion of the will. Rather, divine love through which the Christian's good works operates is God's own love in which the believer is a participant. It is for this reason that St. John says, God is love, and he who abides in love abides in God, and God in him. In other words, through participation in divine love, the believer is transformed by that love to the divine image, which is love, and consequently manifests the properly ethical life, which is defined in the Ten Commandments. As St. John also says, this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments. Love through the Spirit is transformative. As the baptized is made a partaker of the divine nature, it is gradually Christified. The life of the Son continues to crucify the old Adam within the Christian and manifest loving service in the world. This love-centric approach to the ethical life, as I am describing here, is largely dependent on the theology of St. Augustine. And Sartorius is going to make the argument that the ethical life is largely a matter of the proper ordering of affections or of loves. To be rightly ordered, one is to be inflamed with love for God as the affections are drawn toward divine things. This love grows in a number of ways, such as through the continual Christian contemplation of divine gifts. There's much to be said on all of this, but of course I know that I'm running out of time here. Along with the need to love God above earthly things, there's a proper ordering of loves toward created objects and people. There is a universality and a particularity within the call of love as it's given to humanity. So in some sense, all people are to be loved, as Christ's atonement was universal in scope. But there are also proper degrees of love, which depend on one's particular vocations, callings in life. For example, a married man is called to love all women as his fellow human beings who are beloved by God. He is, however, to have a special love toward his own wife that is not to be shown to other women. If a man orders his loves in such a way that another man's wife is loved more than his own, this disordered love is no longer a virtue, but it is a grave sin, the sin of adultery. So the sin here in this act does not consist in the fact that another woman is loved, but that she is loved in a disordered manner. Well, there is much more to say on this topic, and I know that I've set up maybe what is kind of a bit of a lot of information in what is a very brief talk here. But the root of this, and what I want you to get out of this, what I think Sartorius is rightly understanding, is that human beings are beings of affection. We are beings of love. And he's saying this is the nature of reality itself. And that means the question of living out the virtuous life, the question of the virtues, is often a question of love. What is it that you love? What is the proper ordering of love? And that means that moral practice is the alignment of loves in a right and proper order. Well, we'll have much more to say on this, I'm sure, but thank you for listening to this first part of this presentation.
We'll hopefully have a little time for a Q&A at the end, but we'll save those for after Father Sullivan. Thank you.
When I was a child, I would get into a lot of mischief. And my mischief was so frequent and annoying that at one point my parents were at their wits' end as to how to respond to my bedeviling behavior. My dad remembered a verse from the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament that my great-grandmother would quote from time to time. "Train a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." Proverbs 22:6. The Venerable Bede, in commenting on this passage in Proverbs, observes the following, quote, "Because people much more commonly follow the habits which with they were imbued as children for the rest of their lives, it became a proverbial saying that man will not change in his old age whatever he began to do in youth." Even though it always doesn't happen that way, this is the usual way. Bede says the proverb is formulated like this to persuade readers to be zealous for virtue in youth, lest they be unable as adults to learn the practices that they had despised to acquire at a tender age. My understanding of this first part of the conference is to answer the question, what is virtue? And to provide a theological foundation for answering this question that will be unfolded in the rest of the day. In intuiting this idea from Proverbs, my dad started to address this issue as how to inculcate virtue in me. And so he had me write out the entire book of Proverbs. In the evenings after I'd finished my homework, I'd sit down and open the book and painfully pen out verse by verse. I think he was hoping that the seeds of a good habit might be sown and some of the wisdom of Solomon might rub off on me. Now, I don't know if copying out the entire book of Proverbs was helpful, or if it had the effect that my parents had hoped. They would be the judges of that after God. But what I do know is that it gave me an understanding of what it means to try to practice and understand sacred scripture. And of course, there are lots of different ways of trying to evaluate what moral goodness is. So in a very simplistic way, I'm going to use the categories provided by Joseph Fletcher in his famous book published by Westminster Press called Situation Ethics. And he proposes that there are three basic categories. He says, on the one hand is legalism, which is still rather rampant nowadays, the view that moral obligation is determined and defined by law. Law, therefore, confronts human freedom as a form of obligation. Morality is determined by various adherence to laws. For Christians, this would be the commandments, perhaps Kant's categorical imperative, or more thinly, whatever laws are passed by one's government. The notion of legalism, of course, exists outside of Christianity. Perhaps if they're Muslims, the laws are determined by Sharia. Or for secular contemporaries, they're simply trying to obey the state. Whatever legalism one might propose, the trouble with this sort of thinking is that laws or legal precepts always increase. They always address the specific situations, and they cannot change the interior person. We all know that you can obey the law without being a good person. And so law has to be backed by force for those who haven't internalized what law means to inculcate. On the other hand is antinomianism, a term actually that was coined by Luther in response to an increasing sort of rejection not only of what was seen as a false legalism of Catholicism, but also a rejection of moral law in general. And we can't get into the history of the term antinomianism, but essentially it means it's the contrary of legalism, namely the idea that a person is constrained by no laws, no rules, no principles, no unchanging precepts other than his own judgment. This, of course, will lead to chaos. Unfettered conscience, or references to the Holy Spirit if one is Christian, some vague interior conviction, this has been used to justify embezzlement, idolatry, and adultery, which most people would agree is a problem. Now, Joseph Fletcher, he proposed his own ethics. And again, the conference presenters didn't read each other's papers, but it's quite interesting. Joseph Fletcher claimed that his version of ethics was on what he called the sole and supreme principle of love, as an alternative to legalism and antinomianism. According to Fletcher, love is a principled relativism, at least in his view, because it rejects any absolute moral law and it focuses on the interior state of the person who adheres to the triune God. Now, within Fletcher's own ethics, it would be impossible from his own position, which he says, he specifically rejects any particular law in an absolute way. He says that there's no unchangeable precept because the situations change continually. So, of course, from this position, one could not coherently reject tyranny, slavery, or genocide. Now, another option for ethics not considered by Fletcher, and so it doesn't fit within his threefold schema, is virtue theory. It has the advantage of being able to include the best insights of all ethical systems, while transcending them in light of the gospel taught by Jesus Christ. Virtue theory, because it includes the virtue of justice, includes adherence to rule sets, such as the Ten Commandments, as well as just civil laws. I mean, those which are just, not merely civil laws. Those which are to be obeyed out of love of God and neighbor. And yet, virtue theory makes room for the Holy Spirit by recognizing the transformative power of God within the interior man. And so the commandment of love enables creative solutions which are faithful to justice, as well as to the other virtues, such as prudence and fortitude and temperance and all their sub-virtues. Now, what I'd like to do in this brief presentation then is to lay out, well, what is virtue? If we've seen that virtue theory perhaps can provide a great alternative to these other systems, well, what is it? And then the second question I'll try to answer is, how is virtue developed? Now, to understand virtue, it will be necessary to place it within this larger schema, similar to our previous presenter. I'm going to start with a simple definition that was offered by Aristotle and Aquinas, and then we'll go into descend into the nature of things and how virtue might develop in them. Now, according to Aristotle, virtue is a particular kind of habit. It is a good habit. It's good because it perfects the agent who has it, both by perfecting his powers and by directing him to his right end. And it's a habit because it's a semi-permanent quality stamped into a person's soul. Because human virtue is the product of human choice, it's founded on personal responsibility. And so we might say that virtue is in some way the result of self-cultivation. It's mastering the art of being human. It's integral to full human flourishing, and it conduces to that end. Human habits are founded on and measured by human nature, according to St. Thomas Aquinas. He states, quote, "It is of the very nature of a habit to signify some relation to a thing's nature, insofar as it is fitting or unfitting to that nature." So we might put it this way, thinking within scholastic categories, habit is not a substance, it's not a thing. Habit is not a person's essence. It's not one of my powers, like my power of walking or my power of thought. Rather, habit is a quality. It qualifies or shapes the very powers that I have. When one's powers are exercised consistently toward a particular object, we become habituated to that object. And this starts to shape us in some particular way. So we might say, for instance, if a person has a habit of overeating, the habit does not provide the power of nutrition or movement or even the desire for food, but it does shape the way in which I take that bite. So habit shapes my hunger for food, it focuses on it, and it helps me to find particular delight in this object, but it doesn't give me that power in the first place. Okay, so we've seen habits in general, but let's go down to more specifically what is a human habit. And I'll start that by noticing that there's some things that cannot have habits. And the first of which is God. So according to classic Christian theology, habit is a result of change. Change involves potential to become greater or lesser, and this entails some kind of imperfection. God himself is never in a state whereby he lacks a perfection. There is no development or potential within God from the classic perspective. God lacks nothing. God doesn't develop over time. He doesn't become more effective. God is never more truthful today than he was yesterday. Rather, it's God today, yesterday, and forever. God does not change. God's unchangeableness is not the result of being dull or stagnant, as if God stubbornly refuses to change his mind. Rather, God does not change because he exists perfectly. In his substantial goodness, his very being, he never changes from that perfection. If he did, he wouldn't be perfect. And therefore, God has neither dispositions nor habits. God neither has potency to become more than what he already is. And so we might say that God does not have a disposition to love. God cannot have a greater habit for love. God is love. Now, looking at the very other end of the ladder of being, we might say, Aristotle points out, in fact, in his Ethics, he says that material, non-organic things cannot develop habits. So he says no matter how often we throw something into the air, it will not have the habit of being upward, because it has no disposition within it. If I change a material thing, then it will simply change its shape. There's nothing within it that has an interior source of dynamism whereby, when I shape it, this now becomes its own active force. The stone by which nature moves downward cannot be habituated to move upward, he says, not even if one were to train it by throwing it up 10,000 times. Now, what's quite interesting is if we look at organic nature, such as plants, plants can become somewhat habituated. They adapt to their environment in creative ways. The roots of a cypress tree will cling to the face of a cliff where its trunk and branches grow down windward. A rose bush, in fact, can be cultivated to cover many, many square feet. Over a period of time, vegetable life will receive this modification, and it now becomes changed in such a way that its own interior life, if the modifications were according to nature, make the thing more perfect. In other words, if you're a gardener, you can talk about training your rose bush. And if you train it well, it's going to respond by flourishing. You will get more flowers, more beautiful flowers, more fragrant flowers when you train your rose bush well. And this is an analogy of what habit is for an organic life. When a rose bush endures external influences, it undergoes a kind of material change. And so this starts to then recognize its own interior dynamism. A French philosopher, Félix Ravissant, he says this. He says, habit does not simply presuppose nature, it develops in the very direction of nature, and it concurs with it. And so good habits promote flourishing according to that thing's nature. We know that animals, they can be habituated. Their habits are strongest when they are in accordance with their particular natures. And so, for instance, there are different species of dog. The different species of dog can be habituated to do certain kinds of actions. I have friends who they have a dog that's a hunting dog. And, it's really incredible to see these dogs go. They can get the duck, they can bring it back, all without eating the duck. It's really remarkable what some dogs can do in accordance with their nature. If you have a Chihuahua, it can't be trained the way that a hunting dog can be. And if you have a cat, well, it can't be trained to do anything because it's not according to its nature. And so the interior life of the thing can be shaped by exterior inputs. Now, turning to human beings, it should be clear, of course, that not all human powers are susceptible to habituation. Habits cannot exist in powers over which we have no dominion, because we cannot direct our operations by our will when they are simply on the nutritive level. So I am unable to affect my heartbeat directly. I'm unable to directly affect my digestion, which many people know. You travel and your digestion does what it wants. And now, Aquinas points out that there are three ways in which we exercise dominion over ourselves. And he says, one is, by moving and commanding. The second is as moved mover. And then he says the third is as moved only. Okay, so we'll talk about these and how these relate to what is virtue. He says the first way of exercising dominion over oneself is by reason and will commanding our own actions. This actional mode is that in which virtue properly resides. Because he says, quote, the act of virtue is nothing more or nothing less than the good use of free choice to shape our acts and thereby to shape our very interior dispositions. Fully voluntary habits are those which principally relate to the will and the intellect, united to choose some object. And so this is why Augustine defines virtue as a good habit of the mind by which we live rightly, which no one uses wrongly. If you use a virtue wrongly, it's not a virtue, it's a skill. So Aristotle, he says that there are two kinds of basic habits that people can have. One are what he calls hexis, and these are more properly habits, and they're virtues. They have lots of sub-virtues, justice, prudence, so on. And then there's what he calls these things which are skills, arete. And these can be things like you can have a skill in mathematics, you can have a skill in swordsmanship, but these can be used poorly. And so it can't be a virtue simply to be a good mathematician, because if a person uses mathematics in order to create, some destructive weapon that he uses to wipe out innocent people, well, perhaps he's not using it well, is he? Or likewise, you can use swordsmanship either to, save the innocent or to harm the innocent. And so skills aren't virtues even if they're habits. The interior act of virtue is supreme because it places within the source of human morality our very human nature by which it's trying to follow its own directiveness toward the good. Now, the second source of self-dominion are our lower appetitive powers. And these can also be seats of virtue insofar as they can participate in reason. And so, for instance, according to the medieval way of dividing up how our passions operate, our emotions, and so on, he would argue that there's basically two kinds of powers that are below the intellect and the will. And one is the appetite which desires the good. He calls this the concupiscible. And then there's another which is trying to overcome some evil or trying to endure an evil, and he calls this the irascible appetites. So the result of this then is that reason tries to work with our basic desires, either to long for the good that we're moving toward, or to try to overcome some kind of evil. And as reason starts to imbue these powers with its own directiveness, its own intelligibility, either in light of what we know by reason or what we know in reason and faith, then these powers and passions start to become imbued with their own virtue, their own sort of independent willingness toward moving toward the good. Just as each string on a piano ought to be tuned and tempered to allow the notes to harmonize with one another, so a person's passions need to be habituated to act promptly, easily, and joyfully according to reason and with an inner harmony. And so, he says, quote, the good of the operation requires that there be some sense appetite in disposition or perfection by which the appetite easily obeys reason. And this is also what we call virtue. So sometimes we can call somebody a virtuous person because they have a good intention, they want to be just. And we say, okay, well, that person is virtuous in some manner. When the person performs acts of justice, we're like, oh, that's an even better person. And likewise, if a person has good passions, meaning that he's joyful at things that are good, he's sorrowful at the proper things. He's not sorrowful at inappropriate times, but he weeps with those who weep and he laughs with those who laugh. Someone who actually finds joy in doing what's good and performing these actions that are just and helpful, that person is even more virtuous. So we can see the layers of virtue according to the very layers of power. Nicholas Austin, he explains good habits of the appetites. He says that they participate in reason in three ways. He says, first, indirectly, by removing a negative influence on the will. Participatively, by participating in being a principle of right choice, because our passions can help us to do the right thing. And he says, concurrently, by disposing a person together with his will. So if my passions are well ordered, then I actually find it easier to do the right thing. It's not simply that I'm following this legalistic principle whereby I know there's some external law and some external force that can harm me if I don't obey. There's also an interior principle by which I say, this is actually good for me, and it's good for that person, and out of my joy of the good, then I'm more inclined to perform those actions. And this is a greater virtue. Now, the third category of self-dominion, whereby we master those things that have no independence at all, such as where I move my hands or my feet, and and I can affect myself indirectly in that way. This is, properly speaking, not the realm of virtue. As I pointed out before, physical skills and mastery over my lower powers in that sense is not equivalent to virtue. So often we make the mistake in thinking that I want to be like Mike, and if I'm like Michael Jordan, then I'm a virtuous person, and that somehow skill on the ball field is also somehow virtue. And yet we know at the same time we want him to be virtuous. And if he's not virtuous, if he, say, has a gambling habit, that's a less perfect mode of being. And so we want to have people not only develop physical skills, but we want them to have ethical character on top of those skills which they have already mastered. So virtue then is more than a way of doing things rightly. Virtue is more than an obedience to some external law. But virtue is also more than simply this interior sense of my own conscience, a following of my intuition toward the good. Virtue is a habitual state in which your nature is perfected according to its own proper ends. The presence of a habit indicates that the person has acquired a sort of second nature, whereby doing good feels natural, because through his choice he has shaped himself. And the result is a transformation of the person as a whole who has developed personal character. So we've seen what is virtue. But the next question is, how do we develop virtue? And so far I haven't brought in much theology, and some of our friends will be wondering, well, Father Ezra, this sounds wonderful. If you're in the Garden of Eden and you have complete mastery over yourself and your flesh isn't rebelling, then that sounds perfectly fine. But what about for us fallen creatures? What about those of us who have been affected either by the fall of Adam and Eve or by our own childhood, our own choices? How then can we be virtuous? What is virtue in the concrete, real sense? We have to realize that when we come to the issue of virtue and we want to know about its development, we come, as it were, in media res. We come into the middle of things, that we come already habituated. Childhood has shaped us. Your parents, talk to Freud about that. Your neighborhood, your childhood friends, your mentors, your enemies, your culture at large, your language, all shapes you without your will. And even in the womb, what your mother ate, that what a mother eats will affect her child's tastes for the rest of his life. that they've done a number of studies that they had a number of women eat something like a kilo of carrots, twice a week, and then the other, the other women didn't when they were pregnant, and then after they're born, then they try to give their child, this little mashed up carrot, and of course the mothers who were eating these large amounts of carrots, their children loved it. Just naturally. And the other children sort of, they rejected it, sticking their tongues out. So we are affected by what happens inside the womb. Our mother's hormones, we know, affect us. They've done a very interesting study on mothers who are pregnant living near the center of the 9/11 attacks. And basically what they saw was for women who were pregnant 6 months and earlier, that the closer they lived to the site of the Twin Towers which fell, the more they had anxiety, and the more that affected their children, even 10 years. They could predict that a child would do worse in school based on the anxiety that their mother self-reported in experiencing these attacks. It's astonishing. So we come habituated already. And then theologically, we would say that the effects of original sin, the fall of Adam and Eve, this affects us as well. That it is a removal of God's grace from our life such that we tend more often to be selfish, not to seek God, to not look to virtue, but instead to find our own pleasure in lower things. And so when we say that we want to develop virtue and to rid ourselves of bad habits, it's not simply an effort of our own will. We have to recognize that we need the help of God. And that's going to be the beginning of a proper theology of virtue, whereby God shapes our interior life, whereby the grace of Christ replaces these bad habits, and through his own unmerited gift provides us with new habits, whereby we believe in him and we hope in him and we love him, that this starts to make loving God feel more natural. But of course, it's difficult because all habits feel natural, which means that even sin and our negative bad habits, they feel natural to us. We identify ourselves with them. And the result becomes then that in order to remove those bad habits, it's a death to the self, but a life to a new life of good character and virtue. And so if putting away these evil habits and habitual behaviors seems impossible to us, Aquinas advises that we seek God's grace. And this is exemplified, of course, in the life of Christ, who himself was full of good habits and never had an evil one. And so we'll say then that the beginning of any theology of virtue is what St. Paul tells us. He who began a good work in you will bring it to completion on the day of Jesus Christ. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Father Sullivan and Dr. Cooper. Checking the time here, we do have plenty of time for some Q&A for both of our presenters. So I think I'll just open things up. The room's small enough. I don't think we'll have to pass the microphone around.
Yeah, I think so.
Questions, comments that were aroused by our speakers. Let's start with the first one. Yes.
At least two.
This is directed equally to both of you, but obviously your talks are complementary in a number of ways, but I feel like one of perhaps the tensions emerging between the two is whether love is a virtue and how that ought to be properly understood. If so, and if God is the source of love, understood as charity, how can he be the source without himself having it? That could be a fun question we can play with. Or in what way is he the source? But let me just keep it simple and ask to either of you your responses. How do we describe love? Is it proper to refer to it as a virtue?
Yeah, I would refer to love as a virtue. And I think that's it's ubiquitous in the Lutheran tradition and the sources that I've looked at on these issues. Oftentimes, it is said that love is really the only virtue, in that all other virtues are really just different manifestations of the singular virtue of love. So yes, I would define it as virtue.
Augustine, in his On Christian Morals, he actually he says that every virtue can be seen as love. So he says justice is loving to give somebody else what he deserves, and he says like prudence is loving to make the right choice in a difficult moment. So Augustine definitely follows that, and I think Lutherans probably follow that Augustinian tradition.
And that's explicit. Like that particular passage is cited all the time.
Yeah. In Aquinas' view, he would distinguish between love as a passion and love as a virtue. And you see this a little bit, as C.S. Lewis, the Anglican doctor of the church for some, he distinguishes rightly, among four loves, and I won't walk through those, but we basically say from the Catholic perspective that you can reduce it to two, which is one is a passion whereby you can say, I love ice cream, or I have a kind of a love or an affection for something or someone that's delightful, but that doesn't make it virtuous per se. Simply to have a delight or even give myself to something, self-giving is not per se virtuous. So, for instance, you can say that the thief gives of his own energy, he gives of his own life to his other thieves, and thereby, like, they're more effective. And so love in that sense is not a virtue whatsoever. Love is only properly a virtue when it rises to the level of charity, whereby we give to others the grace that we have from Christ, and whereby we receive from others or we desire from others only that which comes from God or leads to Him. And so in that sense, we would say that some sorts of love are like quite unvirtuous, and then other sorts of love, only with those within the realm of grace, those are properly charity per se. I'm not sure if that would...
Yeah, I just think the distinctions, at least in our theologians, are not quite probably as precise there. But there are, in terms of a love toward like an object, if you're, you love ice cream because you like the way it tastes or something like that, right? That's, sometimes things are described as like a pleasing love or a pleasing good, which is, there are loves that really are only love for the sake of satiating something within us. Those can be properly directed in a proper way. So it could be, perhaps eating, 2 full gallons of ice cream would be, an improper way of trying to kind of love a thing for its use or for the pleasure that it gives you. But it should be directed toward it in a proper way. So, just eating a meal because your body needs food and enjoying that meal, that would be a pleasing love or a pleasing good in a proper sense. But I would say in terms of like, you bring up the idea of self-giving. I mean, we do tend to describe love as self-giving, but of course, we need to have a proper end in view as well. And so, I wouldn't say self-giving is inherently virtuous. I would say self-giving toward a proper end is virtuous. And I think that that's where there's a kind of distortion culturally in the way that we perceive of love today, is love is very amorphous. It doesn't have particular ends. There are standards around it. And so, I would say as long as we kind of we need to understand the distinction between self-giving kind of, I guess it's just a kind of bland moral good versus self-giving for a proper end.
I wanted to ask a little bit about the idea of virtues as habits. So I'm in the philosophy department here and work a little bit occasionally on Aristotle. And my Greek is not very good, but my colleague who's a real scholar of the Greek text has told me when we talked about this question that the best Greek word for, that corresponds with the English term habit would be ethos, which is the root of the word that Aristotle uses to talk about the acquisition of the virtues, ethismos. But Aristotle doesn't pick ethos as the category that virtues fall in. He picks hexis. And again, my colleague thinks that it would be a terrible translation of hexis to say that that's habit. So he doesn't think that Aristotle held the view that virtues are habits. And you touched on one of the reasons why that view looks problematic, to me at least, it's that, the comparison between virtues and techne, right? Where he says, you don't show yourself to have any deficiency in the space of a techne if you voluntarily depart from its demands on a particular occasion. But if you voluntarily depart from the demands of a virtue, you show yourself to lack the full measure of that virtue. But if you say virtues are habits, I don't know, I'm in the habit of waking up early. I really do have that habit, but one morning I permit myself voluntarily to sleep later. I don't thereby show any deficiency in the habit, it would seem. And so it looks like habit falls on the techne side of that divide, rather than on the virtue side of that crucial divide. And I think you addressed that question by talking about this extra something that the habits that are the virtues have to possess, this interiority. But I guess I want to hear a little bit about that, and in particular, with respect to the question whether love is a virtue, because love doesn't sound like a habit, to me at least. If I say to my wife, I'm in the habit of loving you, that would seem like a very bizarre way to speak. And so, but it looks like love is all the interiority and none of the, the repetitive habituation. And it flows each time, or its acts flow each time from a kind of inspiration. And so can you fit the virtue of love in the category of habit? And what is this extra thing that a habit has to be a virtue?
Yeah, that's a great question. Excellent. This is where I get to advertise my book on the topic. It's 600 pages, so it's an easy read. But basically, I try to address. That's exactly the problem I try to address, namely this issue of habituation as a simply repetitive exterior act versus some kind of qualitative state of soul whereby you do the good consistently. And that's why I presented things the way I did, to show that the habituation of say plants does, when it's according to their nature, then it is in some way, it's both an exteriorization, but now it becomes the possibility of the expression of the interior life. And so in that way, Aristotle, I think, chooses hexis precisely because he says it's one of the 9 categories. That habit is it's this relationship that you have with your own self. Se habere, I hold myself in some manner, and that means not simply a posture, because that's a separate category. It's the interior posture of your own soul. And once you have that, then you have the beginnings of the notion of virtue as this disposition whereby I hold myself with respect to the good. And then the good is going to be measured by human nature. So the brief answer then is, I would say techne is a simple exteriorization, and it doesn't affect the character because you're not thinking about the good, you don't have the good in mind. It's not teleologically directed toward man's ultimate good, it's only directed toward some immediate good, which in fact might be bad for him or other people. But I think that what Aristotle doesn't quite get to, the reason why he says if you divert from habit at one point whatsoever, then you don't really have it, or maybe you've lost it, is because he doesn't have a stronger notion of the will. I mean, as famous, Aristotle has kind of a weak notion of what is this faculty of choosing the good. And so for him, he can't say that this is going to be the proper place in which this virtue resides. So once you get to the Middle Ages, and they have, thanks to Augustine largely and Boethius, they have a much stronger notion of the distinction between intellect and will, then they can say, well, my will has been habituated toward the good in such a way that it's teleologically beneficial to my nature as a whole. So when you get to the issue of love, and whether love is this like disposition or is it an act, properly I would say it's actually, it is a habit. Because if you say to your wife, I love you right now, but like not when I'm telling you that, if I only love you in this moment. No, she wants you to love her like in some abiding manner whereby if she needs your help, she doesn't have to yell, and you can help her promptly, joyfully, skillfully, and it's coming from your interior sense of your desire to give good toward her. And so love then is a habit, but manifests itself as an act. And if there are no acts of love, then you probably don't have the habit of love. And so the acts manifest the interior disposition. And that's not just a technique, because love isn't simply like helping her out skillfully, because she knows that too. Like she's quite aware when you like do what she wants, but you don't do it lovingly, like it's not good enough. And so she wants you to, just like we want from children. Like we want them not only to like obey, but obey from this sense of like, oh, I recognize this is good. It's good for everybody. I'm doing it out of a sense of joyful self-giving, and that's the manner in which love is properly performed. So I hope I've addressed everything you mentioned. Yeah.
What's your book called? Sorry.
Oh, yes. It's called Habits and Holiness. And it's published by Catholic University of America Press. And I deal a lot with freedom, habituation, skill, and the whole problem of how does repetitive action help or hinder our own flourishing.
Dr. Cooper, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, no, I'm thinking about, the categories that you're using. I'm just thinking about one of our, who was at one time well-known ethicist who's not really read today at all, but a man named Paul von Eitzen. He writes these 4 books on Christian ethics that were widely used at the end of the 16th century. And he distinguishes between virtues in a threefold sense. So he talks about civic virtue, philosophical virtue, and theological virtue. And this civic virtue is basically virtue that is not necessarily really interior at all, right? You are performing acts that are only outwardly good acts. And then he talks about even civic sin, which is really crime, right? That which is publicly going to manifest itself in some wicked act would be a civic sin. But then he has philosophical virtue, which is this kind of habituation, right? We're talking about habits that are more interior than that. They connect with character, but then he's going to say that there are theological virtues. And when we're talking theological virtues, we're talking something that is supernatural, divinely granted by the Spirit, and we're talking more about a character in a far deeper sense than that.
I saw some other hands. Up. Did I see some other hands over here? Yeah.
I had thought I read that the word that Aquinas uses is not habit, but habitus. And it seems to me like meaning something like habituation, a certain kind of ordering, and so on. I have the same problem. The word habit doesn't do any work for me in this regard. When I think of habits, I think biting my nails while I'm trying to write, or I keep my keys in a certain place so I don't lose them, right? So I have a habit of always putting them in the same place or something like that. And I don't think of any of that really as matters of virtue, or of being patient. I don't think of having a habit of patience. That just doesn't seem to me like the right concept. And but anyway, it seemed like I had read that Aquinas does not claim that virtues are habits in the word that we use as habit. He was using the concept of habitus, which is a much different concept and I think a much richer one. So anyway, maybe I got that wrong. I wonder if you could...
No. You're referring to a very influential article written by a Swiss Dominican theologian. I'm sorry? Belgian.
Like Hercule Poirot.
Never speak ill of the dead. He's a Belgian theologian, as I said, and his name is Surveys Pincaires, and he wrote a famous article pretty early on in his intellectual development called, in French, something like habitus is not a habitude. In other words, that he uses Thomas's term in Latin, habitus, and he distinguishes that from the French habitude, which would be habit in English, right? So he makes exactly the point that you're making, which is that in modern psychology, often habit is understood as simply a repetitive act that's kind of robotic and is free from human creativity. And he rightly says that the proper understanding of virtue is this interior disposition that isn't constrained by some kind of compulsion, but rather is the free engagement of our own understanding, our desire for the good, and creatively responding to the situations that we find ourselves in. The part of the book in which I address this issue is I give Pincaires all due credit, while also noticing that Aristotle says that habit is built by repetitive acts. It's very simple, that he says hexis is something that comes by repetitive acts. And what he means is, how do I become just? This is sort of the Platonic question. And the answer is not by studying justice, but by doing just things. And I have to do them consistently. Now you might say, well, I can do all sorts of exterior acts that are that seem to be just, and that doesn't make me a just person. Well, then you haven't done a just act, because a just act includes the will to do what is proper to the other person. So a truly habit of justice means that I am doing justice in such a consistent way that now it's easy for me to be just in certain circumstances. And so it does involve a repetitive act, but the repetitive act always has an interiority that's included within it. And so, so I think that pink hairs rightly help the conversation to move away from sort of Skinnerian ideas of the black box of we don't know what's happening on the interior of the animal, but if we give them certain kinds of rewards or punishments, then they're going to get the right sort of behavioral output that I want. Behaviorism doesn't have like a strong anthropology, and so it doesn't provide the proper understanding of habits, truly speaking. But an understanding of repetition is certainly part of all of our actions. So if you said, honey, of course I love you, we got married 25 years ago, and I said this on the altar. She would say, but you haven't repeated it lately. So you have to repeat the act from some kind of interiority while also being creative in your different ways of manifesting that interior disposition. Yeah.
I have a very simplistic example, I think, of what we're talking about. Even though it's one of my main jobs, housework is not something I love to do. And cleaning up the dishes after dinner is my least favorite thing. You're tired, you just enjoyed a good meal, you don't want to like look at those dishes. So I put it off a little bit, and I'm okay with that. And then it gets to the point where I don't really want to do it at all. But I've come more recently, after 27 years of marriage, thinking, I know if I clean up the kitchen, it's going to remove some stress from my husband. And on that note, I have no problem doing it. And it goes quickly and easily. So it's like, just having it as a habit is too mundane and I don't care about it. But when I do it for the person I care about, it becomes easy.
What you're saying is that's proper ordering of loves, and out of which the habit flows.
And this is, any kind of virtue does require this sort of repeated, the rain falls and it has to be a continual rain. We have to go to liturgy regularly. To go once in our life, it may not inculcate the habit as deeply as if, we recall the cycle of the 7 days and now we're reliving the Sunday as the Lord's Day, that this helps us to return to it, but not simply in an exterior manner to avoid the avenging God, that somehow it's a changing my interior life as well. And I think that's a great example of the interiorization, but also it's something you have to clean up every day. If you put it off too often, then it creates its own problems.
Bad news is that the orders of the day demand that we take a break. We have 15 minutes. The good news is we have 2 more presentations and then another one in the afternoon. And so I think I had some questions of my own as well that I'm going to try to sneak in to later Q&As. So if I ask one of the later speakers a question that doesn't really make sense, it's because I actually want to ask these guys. So feel free to answer. You might be the same there, but we have 15 minutes. Is that right, Brian?
10:45.
Okay. So again, thank you, Dr. Cooper and Father Sullivan. Right.